Our changing climate is more than rising sea levels and greenhouse gas emissions. Countless people suffer heavily from its effects. From floods and fires to failing crops and erratic weather patterns, the impacts devastate people and communities. That's why we've invited two experts to explore the impacts of climate change, how they can be mitigated, and how humanity can adapt to the climate. They are Cameron Price, the convener of EcoLaunch, and Dr. Dayana Mathew, a laboratory research assistant at Rux Energy. After their presentations, they kindly took questions from the audience.
Before I start the Q&A session, I'd like to thank our guests again for sharing their valuable knowledge and experience with us. And as I always say, with step by step and drop by drop, we'll certainly make a big change for a thrivable future. So with that, let's start with the first question, and any of our guests can start answering first. So my question to our speakers is, what are some simple ways through which individuals or communities can contribute to both mitigating climate change and at the same time adapting to its effect?
The first thing is that solutions need to be customized, they contextualized to the particular needs of each local community. And local communities know best what those challenges are because they're living it every day. But they may not have access to scientific modeling or long-term weather forecasts or the details of technical solutions. So the best approach is where a facilitator could come from the community, or it could be facilitated by government or civil society, brokers a relationship to weave together this local intelligence about what the challenges and opportunities are and how nature-based solutions could best be applied in that particular context with world-class, best available information and scientific knowledge. So that's when solutions are much more likely to be accepted and sustained within communities and meet the actual needs rather than some sort of generic template solution.
As an individual, I would like to live a way with more wise energy usage, go more renewable, get and eat sustainably and drive less. So by adopting a lifestyle which is more sustainable and thrivable is the best mitigation strategy in my perspective. And as a community, there are options to start recycling initiatives or to do like composites and gardening initiatives communities can do to mitigate climate change and thereby reduce carbon dioxide emission.
Right, thank you. I mean, what I understand is Cameron mentioned was, I think it starts at a grassroots level, and from there it can flourish to a wider community. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Dayana. I'll come back to Cameron. My question to you is, in your view, how can digital tools or innovation, something like AI, machine learning, can enhance the effectiveness of the overall nature-based solutions?
This is a rapidly emerging and really fascinating area. So normally in the past, there's monitoring, verification, and reporting processes in place. And it's often been achieved by site visits, perhaps looking at measuring ecological change over time with traditional vegetation or fauna surveys. And these aren't replaced, these are still important. But what is possible now is digital monitoring, verification, and reporting. So I'll give some examples. So you can use Internet of Things stations to have acoustic monitoring. And so it's listening the whole time for pollinators, like bees, different types of pollinators, they make different sounds. And so you can actually interpret the sound and get a list of what species are available. Similarly, when bats use their acoustic location, their really high-pitched sound, you can get a sample of what bats are there. Birds, frog calls, things that are traditionally quite difficult to find, especially the smaller things, you can pick up through acoustic monitoring. And also camera traps. You can have these robust cameras that are turned on, they're motion censored, and you can also have them in infrared so you can get them at night. And you can capture or detect the presence of species that are, some of them, they're so elusive that you almost never see them. You might see their tracks or their scats, but you can get a set. The challenge is this is a massive bandwidth of data. How do you interpret that? And this is where machine learning and artificial intelligence come in, because these acoustic and video feeds can be processed, and through things like pattern recognition and image detection, it can then report in real time on what's present. And it can even do things like the acoustic monitoring can detect the sound of chainsaws. So it can set up an alert to, in real time, get a response to things like illegal deforestation. Another one is eDNA. And this is where if you take samples from water and soil, because organisms shed their DNA and these fragments can be found through DNA analysis, you can get an understanding of what species are present, and especially with things that are very difficult to find in the water or in the soil. And that way you can use them with these standardized tests, use them as indicators of ecosystem health and complexity, and then track over time improvements, ecological uplift, which can then be used as the basis for things like biodiversity credits. So yeah, it's a fascinating and interesting and emerging area.
Yes, it is. I never knew that we can use the sound of the animals and species to actually understand the change in environment. That's quite interesting.
The acoustic complexity is an indicator of ecosystem health.
Was very interesting. So I'll come to Dayana. My question to you is, you talked about the relationship between the emission levels and temperature rise in your very first couple slides. According to you, what are the cascading effects of ocean warming on marine biodiversity and fish migration?
Oceans are getting warmed, and the tropical fishes, they're actually living in their like upper limit of temperature tolerance. And if there is further increase in temperature, what these fishes do, they will try to migrate more towards cool waters, like forward movement of fishing communities will be there. For example, tuna. Tuna migration is already reported, and it will affect countries or communities which depends on tuna fisheries and significantly affect the country's economy. And another significant thing is coral reef bleaching. Corals, especially warm water corals, are already in threat of ocean warming. It's actually acts as an area where all the biodiversity is thriving, and coral reefs acts as a nursery for juvenile fish. So coral bleaching, especially massive coral bleaching, disrupts the entire fauna abundance and food chain. Another thing is phytoplanktons. These tiny phytoplanktons, they're very significant in photosynthesis and in the marine food web. And they are very sensitive to ocean warming. So when the amount or level of phytoplanktons decreases, it affects the entire food web and disrupts the cycle, the biodiversity and food cycle.
Thank you for that answer. That was very interesting to know how the food supply or food chain can be disrupted just because the water is getting warmer and warmer day by day. Right. I'll come back to Cameron again. My Second question to you is, um, what are some of the barriers that are still limiting the widespread adoption of nature-based solution? Is it the policy, the funding, or awareness?
So it's a combination of things. So there's a lot of legacy policy that just assumes the grey infrastructure is the default solution. You know, the engineers have been doing this for decades. And so it's both policy shift and a cultural shift within governments to recognize the value and the co-benefits of nature-based solutions. And this is starting to change. So governments are becoming increasingly aware. There was a major global summit in Australia recently. So, but the other thing is finance. So one of the really sophisticated and interesting finance mechanisms is blended finance. So this is where you take government funds instead of just a straight grant, or even philanthropic funding, say from a foundation, and it's used to combine with private equity investment. And the public funding tends to de-risk, or for example, it might act as a guarantee of first loss. So there may not be a loss, but if there is, the government will step in and cover that. That de-risks the investment, which then unlocks much, much larger levels of private capital than would otherwise flow into these projects. And there's other things like sustainability linked debt instruments. And so, however, these are still only a very, very small part of the overall funding mix. And so part of the problem is it takes a very long time, a lot of due diligence, and it's difficult to set up and establish. So funding blockages is one of the other major problems.
Yes, it is. And it's not just for the nature-based solution, but I think government will is the biggest problem where the funding gets drained out. I mean, or it's not being provided to the sectors which are most in need. Right. I'll come back to Dayana. Please help us understand some of the implications of warming motions because you talked about the acidification. So what impact or implication does it have on the organisms like coral or coral reef? I know that you've been talking about through your slides. It would be interesting to know what actions countries like Australia can take to save their coral reef in the longer run.
So the stresses on corals are mainly because of warming and ocean acidification. So in terms of warming, as the water temperature increases, the zooxanthellae, algae present in the coral polyps, they either they die or they move out of this coral reefs to avoid the stresses. So then this beautiful, colorful coral reefs, rich in biodiversity, gets like just bleached white calcium carbonate skeleton. So to avoid that, the first and foremost thing is to limit increase in sea surface like temperature. So increase in sea surface temperature is because of carbon dioxide emission. So we need to limit like fossil fuel usage and footprint to like save coral reefs. So what Australia can do is Australia as a country takes efforts, volunteer efforts to do like carbon accounting, and also we have Great Barrier Reefs, and there are particular area of protected zones. So it actually the country is taking efforts to save coral reefs, but still there are options, mainly by cutting down fossil fuels and also adopting renewable energy. And then there are like local stresses due to deforestation, and then pollution. So those kind of stresses can be avoided, and then country can invest in blue carbon. So in my thoughts, these are the ways to save coral reefs.
Very well said. Thank you, Diana. Now, I have a few questions from our audience. First question is for Cameron. I remember from your slides that you talked about China, how well China is doing, and you talked about spawn cities. So this question is from Jimmy, from one of our audience. He's asking that China's spawn cities have permeable roads to allow water to be absorbed beneath rather than runoff. How exactly is this achieved? Since it seems like a simple solution that can be expanded globally, are there any downsides to it or the challenges in creating this kind of an infrastructure?
Well, firstly, how they work is that the ground itself, the asphalt, is porous. So water that lands on it and runs over it it soaks in, and so it's permeable concrete and paving stones. So what happens is that reduces the flooding, it recharges the groundwater, and it eases the pressure on the stormwater systems. So it does have some challenges. So one is the durability. So these permeable surfaces, they can clog up with sediment over time. And then if it's not maintained, and then the water can't get in. So then, and the other thing is they might wear faster, especially under really heavy traffic. They're not as durable. Another thing is cost and maintenance. So that the installation can be more expensive up front, and then it can be more expensive to maintain over time. So cities have to commit to routine vacuuming. So you've got to vacuum the ground to get all of the sediment out so that it remains porous, or cleaning up the pores. And the other thing is it depends on the soil underneath the substructure. So depending on the climate and the soil, so for example, if you've got an area with high clay soils with high water tables, the infiltration is slowed down because the water's got nowhere to go. It's either blocked by a clay pan, or the water underneath is already saturated, so it's not going to be soaked in further. So there are some limitations. The solution would be to complement this with other nature-based solutions, like, for example, wetlands that can actually soak up and remove water through evapotranspiration. And that, of course, has the co-benefits of recreation. It's quite pleasant, and also provides then habitat for local birds and lizards and insects, improving the biodiversity value within the urban space.
Thank you, Cameron, for that very interesting answer. And thank you to our audience who posed this question to all of us to understand better what spawn cities mean. Right. So we have a question from Jamie as well for Diana. He is asking that mangroves don't grow everywhere. So what are other blue carbon solutions that could be considered for the ocean in those places where mangroves can't grow?
Blue carbon ecosystems, there are like seagrasses, salt marshes, and mangroves. So if mangroves can't be grown in every place, there will be like natural ecosystems like seagrasses, and they can be grown, or whatever ecosystems present, they can be preserved. And there are technologies to increase the photosynthesis rate in the ocean water, like fertilization by adding iron or required nutrients, where there are like waters rich in oxygen and phytoplanktons, but there is no sufficient like iron for the photosynthesis to happen. So adding or dosing nutrients required can increase photosynthesis rate there, and phytoplanktons are actually absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's also another way of sequestration, carbon sequestration, and those carbon will be kind of settling towards the deep ocean and gets stored there for millions of years. So those kind of technologies or options can be adopted.
Right. I'll just add on one more point to this question by one of our audience, Lauren. She's asking, are these mangroves better than bamboo trees?
Yes, because terrestrial areas, there is like saturation level for this carbon, for the soil to store carbon. But what about mangroves is that area, coastal area will be allowing sand or sediment to settle there. So there will be carbon storage. Again, soil and sediment will be accumulating on top of it. So there is no a level of saturation. So mangroves or coastal ecosystems allows like unlimited or kind of like elongated capacity to store carbon.
Thank you for taking those two questions. So I'll quickly come back to Cameron for another question. From your experience, could you help us understand what are the most scalable and cost-effective nature-based solutions that governments can adopt today?
One of them is reforestation or afforestation. So in areas that were previously forested and have been significantly degraded or deforested, by re-establishing vegetation cover, it has many, many benefits. So it stabilizes the soil, it improves the hydrology of the area, it creates habitat, and it has co-benefits such as providing non-wood forest products like honey, nuts, fruit, bark, and other things that can be utilized by local communities. So, and the other thing is it helps mitigate climate change by sequestering carbon. So that's probably one of the main scalable nature-based solutions, is re-establishing forests where there were forests previously.
Right. My question to Dayana, could you please talk us through some of the socio-economic impacts of ocean warming on coastal communities?
So wherever we are in this world, we will be affected directly or indirectly by the effects of ocean warming. But coastal communities are more vulnerable because they are in areas which is just 10-meter above sea level rise. So as ocean warms, it leads to more melting of glaciers and ice sheets and more increase in sea level rise. So as sea level rise, it's more intense flooding and intrusion of seawater. So that will affect the availability of fresh water, and that will affect agriculture and aquaculture. So coastal communities, they directly depend on ocean for their livelihood, food, and culture. So they'll be like more affected. And because of ocean warming, fish migration occurs. And when like fish moves away from their economic zone, it's difficult for those countries to find livelihood because fish is not available as before. And tourism. When corals gets bleached, it's not that attractive for tourists to visit, right? So again, another stressor to more vulnerable people in the coastal communities.
Right. I'll just add on one more point to this. I was reading somewhere, I stand corrected on this, but there's a myth among people of the same nation or the same continent that people or communities living near to the coastal area, it's their problem. If there is any kind of calamity or something like that, it's not our problem because we are landlocked or we are very far away from coastal. So it's a myth. I mean, it impacts every human being in one way or the other. So people need to understand this and accept as quickly as possible that there is a challenge that everyone faces because of this. I'll come back to you, Cameron. How can nature-based solution reach the grassroots level and make an impact in livelihoods of people at large while contributing towards a thrivable future?
So one thing is around awareness. So if there can be campaigns, education programs that raise awareness about nature-based solutions within communities, then that can mobilize and inspire and empower them. Another thing is to proactively support civil society. So yes, individuals and families can play some limited role within their own circles of influence, but a really key component, structural component in society is civil society and non-government organizations. So capacity building programs, funding and training and support to these organizations that are focused on things like nature-based solutions can go a very long way, because they can be the bridge between the local populations within an area and government and industry. And so that then the two-way flow of information is facilitated. And that can unlock possibilities for local communities.
That's a very good answer. Dayana, I'll come to you. Talking about the ocean warming, what defines a marine heat wave and how they are detected? So, if we could talk about some of the irreversible impacts that humankind cannot foresee right now because of this.
So, marine heat wave is prolonged warming of the ocean for at least or more than 5 days. If the ocean temperature, surface ocean temperature is very high for a prolonged period, that is considered as marine heat wave. So in these days, because of the increase in average surface temperature, and if it's clubbed with less windy conditions, then the surface water layer gets warms up and it won't be getting mixed with the cold waters. So that's called stratification. So the warm surface water layer remains there and that area gets more warmed up. To measure this ocean warming or heat waves, there are in situ satellite readings and buoys and other kind of measurement methods are there. So how it affects, that was the other question, right? Yeah. So maybe permanent coral bleaching. So if there is like prolonged marine heat wave, it affects the corals. Permanent bleaching can happen. And similarly, as I answered in a different question, it can affect phytoplankton. So they are very sensitive. So all these primary or very significant fishes or members in the fauna, they're very sensitive to temperature. The prolonged marine heat waves will lead to their collapse. So again, that will disrupt the food chain. So there are some reports about krill. Krill is like a shelled small shrimp-like organism. So there was a heat wave event in 2016, something I read in a paper. So krill, its concentration or its number declined because it's very sensitive to this increased temperature. And there are other mammals, including whales and penguins, depends on krills for their food. And once the amount of krill decreased or declined in that water, another poisonous kind of organism started increasing or proliferating over there, and it affected those mammals. So everything in the ecosystem is interconnected and dependent. So heat wave events can disturb the entire system.
Right, the ecosystem or the food system balance. Cameron, I remember towards the end of your presentation, when you heard that chime, you were talking about the government initiatives and how government can better itself to adopt nature-based solution. My question is, like, of course, in our audience, there may be educators, there may be activists, there may be youth leaders or just laypersons who want to understand what these nature-based solutions are. So from their point of view, if they want to understand how can government better integrate nature-based solution into national climate action plans strategies, if we were to talk about the SDGs.
So there's a few parts to that. So from the perspective of individual citizens and residents, they can empower themselves by becoming familiar with nature-based solutions. There's lots and lots of material. There's plenty of documents, websites, podcasts, YouTube videos. And so they can open up ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT, what is nature-based solutions? So there's the knowledge is not the problem. The challenge is people don't know what they don't know, and they may not even know to ask. So this is where community education comes in. But the other part of your question was around the response of governments and policy. And increasingly, the recognition in recent years of nature-based solutions is leading governments to incorporate and explicitly reference nature-based solutions in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So these are, for those who don't know, these are the documents that governments that are signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity commit to report to each of the Conference of Parties. It's pretty embarrassing, actually, I have to say. At COP16 in Cali, many governments hadn't done their homework. Their assignments were late and they had no extensions. So after it had been 2 full years since COP15 across, it was in Kunming initially and then Montreal, 2 years, and many governments hadn't created their national biodiversity strategy and action plans at 2 years. But increasingly, they're getting them done. This is to tie back to the first part of your question. For anyone with an active interest, that's actually a really good place to start. So whatever country you're in, yes, become familiar with global instruments, like, for example, the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Strategy that provides overall context about where we're headed. It sets the vision of protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030. That's the 30 by 30 goal. And stopping the degradation, healing nature, and living in harmony with nature. So that's a really important starting point. But depending on what country you're in, looking up and reading the National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan is a really good place to start. And there's a contact person in each of them as well. So that's one way in.
Thank you for that insightful information. Yes, it will help many of us who are watching you and listening to you. Dayana, I'll come back to you. How effective are the existing international frameworks? As I just had a question for Cameron as well, so I'm just asking you in that reference. There are frameworks like UN SDGs, and are they good enough in protecting the ocean?
We are improving because there are frameworks like UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So for a long period of time, ocean wasn't considered as kind of a solution. And it was like really ignored in climate change studies. And now, because of these frameworks, climate change is considered as a driver of ocean warming, sea level rise, and acidification. So it promotes these frameworks and policies promote ocean-based solutions, but the problem is there is no enforcement of law. So the waters are shared by different countries, and policies in different countries may be different, and there are like fishing, like very intense, uncontrolled fishing. But since these policies are not like enforced by law, there are limitations to control all these. So it's not that effective, but working forward, I guess.
Now I understand what you're trying to say. Yes, if it is land, then probably we are able to demarcate via boundaries and enforce law. With oceans, it becomes a bit trickier and difficult. I do understand that. Right. Now I have questions from our audience. We have one of our audience. Her name is Liz. So it's a question directed to Cameron. She's asking, how do we meet the challenges of scaling, especially in large Western urban or suburban areas that lack community spirit or connection? Are there any examples of people or large communities succeeding in scaling the nature-based solutions?
One thing is governance-led scaling. So in many cases, it starts top-down, so not with community mobilization. But through strong local governance, nature-based solutions can be embedded into statutory planning. So for example, Melbourne's urban forest strategy. So that mandates canopy cover across the area. It sets targets and it integrates nature-based solutions into transport corridors. Another example is in Portland in the USA. They've integrated nature-based solutions into zoning. So they're incentivizing green roofs and they're requiring green stormwater infrastructure in developments. So this is a way it doesn't rely on grassroots energy at first, but it can create a citywide consistency that brings nature-based solutions into the capital works budget. Another thing is to build up institutional anchors as catalysts. So things like schools, hospitals, libraries, these key, substantial, high-profile organizations can function as examples. So, for example, in Barcelona, the schoolyards are being depaved and they're greened, and that reduces the heat and it gives the students some relief. Another example, in Toronto, there's public hospitals that have green roofs and gardens, and they engage volunteers and local food groups. So this is a way they can build social connections through nature-based solutions. Another thing is in reframing outcomes to build the support. So often nature-based solutions, they're not supported or they're not seen as climate interventions. But if you can emphasize the role in reducing flood risk, so avoiding property damage, now that's interesting for people that own property, or cooling playgrounds and footpaths for child safety, so anyone has a child, suddenly that's important to them, or it can raise property values or reduce council maintenance costs. Now that's interesting. So when you align the benefits of nature-based solutions with what is important to people, you can end up getting their support. And then when you get general support, all of these other benefits, including climate mitigation and adaptation, can come in. And just quickly, the fourth thing is you can have hybrid delivery models. So some cities are pioneering these hybrid models that they combine council investment with like light touch community involvement. So an example is London's Green Infrastructure Task Force. So that integrates nature-based solutions into regeneration zones. And another one is in Paris. They've got a participatory greening scheme. So, and residents can adopt small plots within the city, and they're provided with plants and guidance, and that builds local pride. And so this is a way of getting that social cohesion by local government especially, and city governments working with communities and community groups to facilitate nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Cameron, for coming across those points, and it was very informative. I have a question for Dayana from the audience side. With a special focus on business-minded entities, how can the ocean warming can be created as a business model which can help or support the customer, the business, or the entities? I mean, something like the government can come in with the private player to help ease down the global warming, which is impacting the ocean and the rivers and the marine biodiversity. Have there been any such solutions which are led by the private entities?
So I don't know how to make it as a business model, but there are like opportunities to make like dashboards or kind of information websites, those kind of things that can serve as a like intermediate state between the business and people, and then promote finance, carbon finance. So if there is like more carbon finance opportunities, and if it's like more promoted, that will be benefiting. At the same time, business model can use this dashboard or website to like spread the information. Yeah, kind of like I'm not
No, that's
expert.
fine. That's fine.
Yeah, yes.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
The only the reason I think that question was being asked was because it is kind of tough and very expensive to have anything to do with oceans, like even oil and gas exploration. It's quite risky. It's quite money-intensive projects. So I understand the government, the community should be more aware of their doings, and they should restrict their activities so that they produce less of carbon, and which will eventually lower down the temperatures, and which will eventually impact less the biodiversity or the marine biodiversity. So I think the question was more diverted to the business-minded entities. They are ready to bring in money, and if there are any such projects which can help in these kind of causes, so that's perfectly fine. Right. I think one more question was related to reforestation, because Cameron, you just mentioned in one of your answers about the reforestation. So a question from one of our audience: how can we explore reforestation as much as we would love to happen it if we cannot stop deforestation? For example, I understand that Brazilian government is exploring global financing carbon schemes that may ultimately protect the Amazon. But will it take time to design and then world leaders to commit to such actions?
So this is a really critical question. Like, of course, it's good to and critically important to restore degraded areas and to reforest where forests have been lost. But if at the same time existing mature intact forests are being destroyed en masse, it's kind of a little bit like bailing water while the tap's still running. So we need to get to the tackle the root cause. Why is it that this is happening? So things like unsustainable agriculture, weak land tenure, and in many countries where this is occurring, there's not a strong rule of law. There's corruption. These are difficult and long-term, very complex problems that relate beyond just deforestation, a weak state. So one way is to strengthen governance. So civil education, building the capacity of law enforcement, supporting Indigenous land rights. That's a really critical thing, because often, particularly in Brazil and other Amazonian countries, weak land rights with Indigenous people mean that they're vulnerable to illegal logging. They don't have any recourse. Another thing is to shift the financial flows. So to redirect subsidies and investments away from deforestation drivers. Now, these things happen for a reason. They don't just happen. There's money in it. You take the money away, then you suddenly realign the incentives, and you can redirect it away from deforestation to drivers that support regenerative land use. Another really key thing is to build local alternatives. So it might be easy to judge from a distance, but again, local communities do things for a reason. And often it's because, well, they need a source of income for their own livelihood. They've got families to feed. Like if I had a choice, if my child was facing malnutrition and I had to cut down trees to raise cattle or sell timber, I would do that. So you need to create alternatives. And so any solution, any conservation solution also has to consider the local livelihoods to give some economic options for communities so that forests then are worth more standing than they are cleared.
Thank you for that answer, Cameron. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jimmy, for that question. So that question was posted by Jimmy. Well, we are coming to the closing section of this webinar, and we are running short of time. And this restricts me to ask any further questions from my side or from my audience. But I would request our speakers to answer the remaining questions offline. And for our viewers, do sign up to our newsletter to get access to access to the answers to all the questions, and that will be answered offline. And for any of the latest updates from our side. With that, thank you very much. Thank you to our guest speakers today for having spent this time with us to educate and inform us better about the climate change mitigation and adaptation.